When I was a kid, my brothers and sister and I would play Monopoly. Does anybody know what Monopoly is, the game? Has anyone played it? It's an American board game. I've actually seen it in Korea and Hong Kong, but so I think it's fairly international, but it was a lot of fun. You might remember that the object of the game was and is to build so much wealth that you would bankrupt the other players so that you would end up with everything and the other guys would have nothing. And while we all wanted to win, I don't think any of us took the objective of the game very seriously. In other words, I don't think any of us saw Monopoly as a metaphor and recipe for life. But I do think that we saw in that game a lesson to be prudent in our savings and that it was necessary at times to make strategic purchases. This was stuff we had learned from our parents anyway, so the game became sort of a reinforcement of the good parenting that we'd received. To my knowledge, none of us aspired to be wealthy or acquire possessions beyond our ability to use them properly. So aside from owning Boardwalk and Park Place every now and again, and aside from saving a bit of our earnings for the security of our families, not to mention retirement, none of us ever got too focused on wealth, but that probably had more to do with a mindset that was never really geared toward that anyway. Besides, none of us ever made enough to suggest that amassing a great wealth could be a possibility at all. Still, that doesn't mean that my brothers and sister and I didn't think about that kind of thing. And in my case, there was a period of time where I actually read some books about building wealth. This went on for a couple of years when I was much younger, and it came to an end when the realities of family life began to force those notions out of my thinking. Well, today's gospel reading is Jesus' teaching on what you might consider counterfeit wealth versus real wealth. We hear about the rich fool who laid up earthly wealth and treasure in a completely selfish way. It was all for him, and he celebrated his wealth by eating and drinking and being merry. Now, don't get me wrong, those are not bad things in themselves, especially in moderation. And Jesus himself was known for engaging in them from time to time. He was even accused by some as being a drunkard, which he wasn't, but you understand my point, I think. The wealth and the extravagant living, that's what we would call the counterfeit wealth. In other words, lots in the bank, solely for me, and a life of leisure and privilege. Again, focused solely on myself. And whether we're seriously wealthy or not, I think most of us have flirted with the idea and the desire at times of having that kind of advantage. I know I have. But Jesus tells us today that the real kind of wealth that we should set our sights on is not that artificial kind of wealth. Instead, what we should be focused on is what matters to God. And in light of that, he says that there's a kind of wealth that we can build and accumulate that is pleasing to God and will enable rewards that far surpass what amounts to a fleeting and temporary wealth that is possible on this earth. And so for Jesus, there's the kind of wealth that you can't take with you when you die. And then there's the kind of wealth that you can take with you. And he's telling us that we should build up that kind of wealth. He encourages it, and he even promotes it today. The real wealth, true wealth, is spiritual wealth, and that consists in being rich in the things of God. Earthly life is good, but we aren't meant to live here forever. And for that reason alone, our life here is not what we should be centered on, to the exclusion of where we'll be living once our earthly lives are over. Our first reading reinforces that when it says that all things are vanity. Now, vanity here does not mean the pride that I take in how I appear to myself and others, although it can be a part of it. It means that the things of this world, including my pride, are fleeting, temporary, and will eventually pass. These things are not permanent. The fool of our gospel thinks that all his stuff means that he has somehow secured happiness for himself. He's forgotten the basic truth that in the long run, life is short. He'd have been better off with one additional consideration, that in some way, God had blessed him so that he in turn could bless others. Had he considered that, it would have led him to some new priorities and a place for better things in his life. Now, our lives and our possessions do not really belong to us. They are not our own. They belong to God, and we're merely stewards for the time that God has given us to be here. Yet, it's true, we have a tendency to rebel against this because we want to be in charge of our lives and in charge of our things. And so it's likely that most of us have attachments to something or some things that may be keeping us from a more complete attachment to God. Now, I should add that I'm not talking just about churchy things, piety and all that, when it comes to things of God. Yes, they're important, and I would never want to discourage them. But there's a sort of an unglamorous side to the things of God that we should not forget. The things that you do as parents for your kids, or taking care of an ailing relative or friend. It might even be feeble efforts to help the homeless or those who are discriminated against. So it could be very useful to do a kind of inventory, an assessment of where you are right now. So here's a couple of questions you might ask yourself over the next couple of days. The first one is this: who and what is most important in my life? Is it money or status or possessions or esteem? Or is it the people that I love and people who have need of me? The second question is this: do I work to make a difference in the world by my love, my care, and my generosity? And do I share the gifts that God has given me? These questions can help reorient ourselves, and I suggest you give them a try and see where you might find some area in which you might seek some improvement. I think we can all find some aspect of our lives that could use a little boost toward the things of God.